The Civil War had ended. The chains of slavery were legally broken. But freedom was just the beginning of a new kind of struggle. For thousands of formerly enslaved people in the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, freedom didn't bring safety. It didn't bring justice. Take a woman like Rachel, once enslaved in the Cherokee Nation. After the war, the U.S. government forced her tribe to grant her and her family's citizenship. On paper, she was free and recognized. In reality, her neighbors still treated her as property. She couldn't vote, couldn't own land, and faced constant threats from those unwilling to accept a changed order. Her family's promises were empty, and her legal rights were constantly challenged. This wasn't an isolated story. Thousands lived this half freedom, half captivity, caught between treaties and tribal politics. The U.S. government had signed treaties in 1866 demanding that the tribes recognize the freedmen, the formerly enslaved, as full citizens. But enforcement was weak. Tribal sovereignty clashed with federal oversight. Some tribes complied reluctantly, others resisted openly. Freedmen often found themselves stuck in legal battles for land, inheritance, and recognition that would last generations. And yet, these voices were almost erased from history. The textbooks often speak of freedom as if it arrived fully formed, like a gift, but it was a promise constantly denied. These were people who had survived the most brutal system of human bondage only to face new walls built by law, tradition, and prejudice. If you think justice was served just like that, pause and hit that subscribe button, or I'll assume you enjoy unpaid bills and awkward family dinners. Like, comment, share, let's make history viral, because the stories they tried to erase deserve to be heard. In 1865, the war ended, and with it, legal slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would exist in the nation. On paper, it was a revolutionary moment, for million enslaved Black Americans were now legally free. But legal freedom and lived freedom were not the same thing. Freedom meant stepping off plantations with no land, no compensation, and often no knowledge of where loved ones had been sold. Families torn apart by auctions now searched desperately across states for missing husbands, wives, and children. Newspaper ads filled with simple, heartbreaking lines. Information wanted of my mother. Freedom began with loss. Across the South and in Indian Territory, new laws called black codes quickly appeared. These laws restricted movement, limited job options, controlled labor contracts, and criminalized minor offenses. A freed man without proof of employment could be arrested and forced back into unpaid labor. Violence from white supremacist groups surged. Freedom came with fear. Reconstruction promised change. Federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce new rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was created to assist formerly enslaved people with food, education, and labor contracts. For a brief moment, there was hope. Black schools opened, churches grew, and political participation began to rise. But the resistance was immediate and fierce. The end of slavery did not end the struggle. It simply changed its shape. Chains were replaced with laws. Auctions were replaced with contracts designed to trap. Violence moved from the plantation yard to the courthouse steps. Freedom had been declared. Justice was still being negotiated. And for many, survival was still a daily battle. Reconstruction began in 1865 with a bold promise: rebuild the nation and integrate the million newly freed people into American political and social life. For a brief moment, it looked possible. Black men voted. Black representatives were elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. Public schools for black children expanded across the South. The nation appeared to be rewriting itself. But Reconstruction was a battlefield without gunfire. Southern states quickly passed black codes, laws carefully designed to control freedom without calling it slavery. Vagrancy laws allowed authorities to arrest black men simply for being unemployed. Once arrested, they could be fined. If they couldn't pay, they were leased out for labor. It was a new system wearing legal clothes. Land was the deepest wound. Many freed families believed they would receive land, 40 acres, and a mule, after generations of unpaid labor. Some briefly settled on confiscated plantations, but federal policy shifted. Much of that land was returned to former Confederate owners. Families who had started building homes were forced off the soil they thought was finally theirs. Imagine a father who had survived the plantation, now standing with his children as soldiers inform him the land is no longer his. Legally free, practically dispossessed. Education faced resistance too. Schools for black children were burned. Teachers were threatened. Violence became a political tool to intimidate voters and suppress participation. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror to weaken Reconstruction governments. And by 1877, federal troops withdrew from South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The protections faded, the promises weakened. They were free, but freedom came with chains no one expected, chains built from law, policy, and fear. The war had. By the late 1860s, it became clear freedom would not survive without resistance. As Reconstruction faced violent backlash, black communities did not simply endure. They organized. Churches became command centers. Schools became symbols of defiance. Ordinary people stepped into extraordinary roles. The Freedmen's Bureau had helped establish schools across the South. But when federal support weakened, black communities funded and protected those classrooms themselves. Teachers, many of them formerly enslaved, taught children and adults to read at night, sometimes in secret, knowing schools were targets for arson. Education was more than literacy. It was protection. It was power. Black ministers preached more than scripture. They preached citizenship, dignity, and political participation. Churches became meeting halls where strategies were discussed and voter registration organized. Faith and civic action moved together. Newspapers emerged as weapons of truth. Publications like the Christian Recorder and other black presses reported violence that white-owned papers ignored. They documented lynchings, exposed unfair labor contracts, and urged readers to vote and stay politically engaged. Printing a newspaper in that era was an act of courage. Resistance also meant political participation. Despite intimidation from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, black men continued registering and voting where federal troops offered even limited protection. Some were elected as sheriffs, legislators, and congressmen. They passed laws expanding public education and civil rights protections, achievements often erased from simplified narratives of Reconstruction failure. But resilience was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like a mother teaching her child to read by candlelight. A father insisting on signing a labor contract instead of accepting verbal terms. A community rebuilding a burned schoolhouse with their own hands. Violence tried to silence them. Policy tried to restrict them. But resistance lived in daily decisions. To gather, to learn, to publish, to vote. They understood something powerful. Freedom is not a moment declared by law. It is a condition defended by community. Reconstruction would eventually collapse in 1877. Federal troops would withdraw. Many protections would fade. But the infrastructure of resistance, churches, schools, newspapers, political networks, remained. And that quiet resilience would shape every civil rights struggle that followed. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, the protections that once guarded black citizenship began to collapse. What followed was not accidental. It was systematic. Across the South, Jim Crow laws legalized segregation in schools, transportation, housing, and public life. Voting rights were stripped away through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. The progress made during Reconstruction was rolled back piece by piece. The Supreme Court reinforced this retreat. In Plessy v. Ferguson, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional, a decision that legalized racial segregation for decades. Equality under the law became equality in name only. Economically, systems like sharecropping trapped black families in cycles of debt. Politically, voter suppression silenced millions. Socially, racial violence enforced a rigid hierarchy. The long shadow of slavery did not disappear. It adapted. And yet, resistance never died. The groundwork laid during Reconstruction, churches, schools, community networks, fueled the civil rights movement nearly a century later. The struggle was not a straight line. It was a relay race across generations. So here's the question we can't avoid. If the war ended slavery, but not injustice, what does that tell us about freedom today? Freedom declared by law is powerful, but freedom protected by institutions, culture, and courage, that's something deeper. History is not just a record of what happened. It is a mirror. It asks us whether promises made are promises kept. If you believe justice is still a work in progress, drop a comment below. Don't worry, I won't grade your answers. Yet. Because the story didn't end in 1865, and it hasn't ended now. The Civil War ended slavery in 1865. That is a fact. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished the legal institution of human bondage. But history shows us something deeper. Ending a system is not the same as ending its consequences. Reconstruction tried to build a new democracy. It expanded voting rights. It established public education in the South. It briefly redefined citizenship. But backlash, violence, and shifting political will weakened those gains. Segregation followed. Disenfranchisement followed. Inequality adapted. And yet, so did resilience. From Reconstruction churches to early black newspapers, from sharecropping fields to courtrooms challenging segregation, each generation carried the unfinished work forward. The fight for justice did not disappear. It evolved. It moved. It endured. That is the lesson history leaves us with. The chains were broken, but the fight continues. Not just in laws, not just in court decisions, but in conversations, classrooms, communities, and everyday choices. History is not a distant memory. It is a foundation we still stand on, uneven in places, strengthened in others. Every story matters. Every voice counts. And maybe the most powerful truth is this: justice has never been automatic. It has always required participation. So if this opened your eyes, and maybe even stretched your heart a little, hit like, subscribe, and share. Let's make history travel further than misinformation ever could. Share it with that friend who says history is boring. Because history isn't boring. It's unfinished, and we're still writing it.